14 races show up again and again in the history of Tamriel under one lazy label, extinct. But line them up side by side and it turns out 4 different things actually happened to them. Some were killed outright, in wars or by disease that swept through and didn't stop until almost nobody was left. Some just faded away over a few centuries, with no war anybody fought and no plague anybody caught, until one day people realized they hadn't seen any of them in a long while. Some transformed into something else entirely and are still around today, walking through Tamriel under a different name and a different face. And one people, only one, actually vanished all at once, with no war finishing them off and no fading away and no new name to answer to. That's 4 different endings hiding under one word, and it helps to keep track of which is which as each of these 14 comes up. Start with the Snow Elves, because their story sets the pattern for what a fake extinction looks like. The Snow Elves were Mer, related to the High Elves of Somerset, and by most accounts, they had a civilization that could stand next to Somerset's own. They had white hair, pale skin, and lived a very long life, the way most elves do. What set them apart was the cold. Snow elves could live comfortably in ice caverns, resistant to frost in a way no other race on Tamriel could match, to the point that they were basically immune to it. They ruled most of Skyrim before the Nords ever showed up, along with parts of High Rock, and their empire was wealthy and advanced for its time, showing power beyond what people expected from a civilization that old. Not much detail survives about how Snow Elf society actually worked day to day, but what's left suggests something close to the Altmer of Somerset. They kept contact with other elven kingdoms, developed their own written alphabet so complicated that almost nobody else in Tamriel could read it, and worked out their own way of tracking time. They worshipped many of the same gods the Altmer did, Auriel chief among them, along with Trinimac, Sirabane, Jeffra, and Finaster, and built temples to every one of them, though none as grand as the Chantry. They're even said to have bred a hardy species of snow cedar tough enough to grow inside the heart of a glacier. For a long while, the Snow Elves and the Nords, coming over from Atmora, lived alongside each other well enough. That changed with the Night of Tears. Nobody agrees on exactly why the Snow Elves attacked the human city of Sarthal one night and burned it to the ground. Some sources point to fear, some to a religious grudge, some to a plain territorial dispute, and some say the Snow Elves wanted an ancient magical artifact, the Eye of Magnus, that the humans had dug up. Whatever the reason, the attack happened, and it barely left survivors. Ysgramor escaped, along with his 2 sons, Yingol and Ylgar, and fled back to Atmora. He came back with 500 companions and a lot of anger. Ysgramor's men killed Snow Elves by the thousands, and are said to have made necklaces out of their ears as trophies. Nords still sing about it. The slaying of the Falmer princes is one of the more popular songs in Skyrim to this day, and it celebrates exactly what it sounds like it celebrates. Organized Snow Elf resistance broke first in Skyrim, and then on the island of Solstheim, where their leader, known as the Snow Prince, died in the Battle of the Mouse Ring. After that, the Snow Elves were finished as a power in the region, even though pockets of them held out for a couple more centuries into the early years of the First Era. They even built the Chantry of Auriel during that stretch, a huge and carefully hidden piece of architecture that would be impressive even today. It wasn't until the reign of the Nordic High King Harald that the last of them were pushed out of Skyrim's borders for good, and even then some kept hiding. With their homes gone and their armies broken, most of the surviving Snow Elves turned to the only other Mer known to live in Skyrim, the Dwemer, who had built entire cities underground and had never been beaten by the Nords. There were old legends among the Snow Elves praising the honor of the Dwemer, so it must have felt like a reasonable place to turn. The Dwemer said yes. They offered the Snow Elves a home in their underground cities, but the price was steep. The The Dwemer forced their new wards to live on nothing but a toxic fungus that grew in the deep caverns, and that fungus took away their sight. What started as an act of shelter turned into servitude, and the servitude turned into slavery. Generations passed underground, cut off from sunlight, eating poison because it was the only food they had, and the toxin didn't just blind them, it twisted them. That twisting produced the Falmer. Modern Falmer are hunched, roughly man-sized, but nothing like their snow elf ancestors to look at. They have no noses, just long slits for nostrils. Their skin is pale and sickly, and their eyes are dead and black. People who run into them in Dwemer ruins usually smell them before they see them. They look more like goblins than like elves, and most people in Tamriel who encounter them have no idea the Falmer used to be snow elves at all. There's a piece of Nordic folklore that says the Falmer have no noses because Isgramor cut them off himself so his men could tell snow elves apart from other elves during the fighting. That's just a folk story, and nobody treats it as confirmed history, but it's the kind of detail that sticks, and it says something about how thoroughly the Nords wanted to erase the distinction between elf and enemy. Eventually, the enslaved snow elves rebelled against their Dwemer masters. That rebellion is sometimes called the War of the Crag, and it raged for decades in the tunnels below Skyrim, while the Nords on the surface had no idea any of it was happening. The war ended when the entire Dwemer race disappeared, around the year 700 of the First Era, an event that gets its own place later in this list. With their masters gone, the newly free Falmer spread out through Blackreach and the other abandoned Dwemer ruins, and eventually started raiding the surface, which is where most people in Skyrim still run into them today. Not every enslaved snow elf ended up in Dwemer hands either. Nords took their own share of Falmer captives during the earlier stretch of the conquest and forced them to help build the city of Windhelm, stone by stone, meaning a city still standing and lived in today has blind, enslaved snow elf labor buried somewhere in its own foundations. Whatever's left of Falmer religion by now seems to center on a single name, a figure called Exrib, though almost nothing about what Exrib actually represents to them has ever made it back to the surface world. One detail gets missed a lot. Not every snow elf took the Dwemer's deal. An unknown number of them refused it outright and went into hiding instead, in shrines and with sympathetic human families, instead of trading their sight away for shelter. More than 100 of them were gathered at the isolated chantry of Auriel when word of the Dwemer's offer reached them, too late to stop the others from taking it. Those holdouts looked at their twisted cousins with pity, though the feeling wasn't returned. The Falmer attacked untainted snow elves with the same violence they showed everyone else. The pilgrims who did make it to that isolated chantry were chasing something specific, a long, grueling pilgrimage through the whole complex, ending in an audience with the Archcurate, the one snow elf allowed to speak with Auriel directly. Only 6 pilgrims in the chantry's whole history actually finished that journey and were granted a kind of immortality for it, Knight Paladin Gelebor among them. The last Archcurate, a snow elf named Verther, was infected with vampirism by one of his own initiates right around the time everything fell apart, and he spent the centuries afterward plotting revenge against Auriel for allowing his people to be betrayed in the first place. When the Falmer eventually found the chantry itself, they swarmed it in huge numbers and killed every one of the roughly 100 snow elves sheltering there, which is how Gelebor ended up the only one left. Falmer life today runs entirely on what the deep caverns provide. They keep Shaurus, large venomous insects, the way surface dwellers keep livestock, and use the chitin to build armor, weapons, and huts. They fish the underground waterways and cook the same fungus that blinded their ancestors, since it's the only food they've ever known. Tanning racks found next to human remains in some ruins have led to suspicion that the Falmer eat their captives along with everything else they scavenge. Nordic folklore has piled up a whole set of extra legends trying to explain what became of the snow elves, from a frozen wizard named Serenarth. said to still be waiting inside a glacier to take revenge on Ysgramor's heirs, to claims that the goblin-like Reeklings of Solstheim, or the strange spirits called Wisp Mothers, are somehow the last true trace of snow elf blood. None of those claims has ever been confirmed. They're just the stories people still tell about a people most of Tamriel forgot were ever real. One of the odder Nordic sailor tales, called the Ship of Ice, ties the fall of the snow elves directly to the fate of Atmora itself. In it, a snow elf child meets Nordic sailors at the port of Ylkurfik and tells them plainly that their own homeland has now frozen over, the same way theirs was destroyed by Nordic weapons, and she tells the sailors to look one last time at the shores their ancestors' choices left behind. Whether that's meant as literal history or just a piece of folk morality aimed at the Nords themselves. It's one of the few surviving stories that treats the destruction of the snow elves as something with a cost attached, rather than simply a victory worth singing about. The clearest physical evidence of snow elf civilization only turned up by accident, centuries later. The great statue of Erken Hand, a huge monument built in secret by the betrayed, sat hidden and undisturbed until the Thieves' Guild stumbled onto it. When the thieves pried the statue's eyes loose, giant gems worth a fortune, the whole cavern collapsed and buried what might have been the single clearest surviving image of the ancient snow elves under solid rock. A treasure hunt wiped out one of the best chances anyone had to actually see what these people used to look like. A few other legends tried to make sense of why the snow elves fell as hard as they did. Some blamed a god of luck named Sai, said to have favored the Nords and simply neglected the snow elves at the moment it mattered most. A scholar named Amalian built an entire theory around dragons: the Dwemer, the god Magnus, a band of wandering Atmoran skalds, and, oddly, a six-legged mammoth, though it's fair to say, nobody has ever taken that particular theory very seriously. Even stranger legends claim the snow elves once raised giant insects in their deepest caverns, fattening them before harvesting their nearly indestructible shells. None of that changes what actually happened to them. It just shows how much room got left for legend to fill in once the real details stopped being remembered. Falmer activity didn't stay confined to random raids either, once they had the run of Blackreach to themselves. During the interregnum, a Bosmer mage named Dislandra struck a bargain with the Blackreach, Falmer, and the other creatures living down there, trading a share of her own poorly understood magic for their service. A Falmer, known as Palefingers, became her main agent among them, and rather than being tightly controlled, he was mostly just let loose to cause damage on the surface, while Dislandra worked her own plans underground. Around the year 582 of the Second Era, Palefingers led a wave of raids on eastern Skyrim and even besieged Windhelm itself, and the terror he caused eventually forced an order called the Outer Watch to step in and expose Dislandra's whole scheme. It's a small, strange episode, but it says something about how the Falmer never really went away after the Dwemer vanished. They just kept showing up in Skyrim's history again and again, mostly unnoticed until they weren't. For most of Tamriel's history since, people believed the snow elves were simply gone, a near-forgotten legend, and the fact that some of them had degenerated into the Falmer was treated as an outlandish claim whenever anyone brought it up. That changed only slowly, starting with the discovery of the Snow Prince's remains in a barrow on Solstheim centuries later. Even now, most people who meet a Falmer have no idea what they're really looking at. At least one snow elf is known for certain to have survived into modern times without being corrupted: Knight Paladin Gelebor of the Chantry of Oriel, who is believed to be the last one anybody can point to. Gelebor draws a sharp line between the words snow elf and Falmer because of everything the second word has come to mean, and he calls his fallen kin the betrayed instead. He thinks it's possible other small groups of snow elves are still out there somewhere on Nirn, hidden away and uncorrupted, nobody the wiser. No one really knows if that's true. It might be. The lore just doesn't say. So the snow elves aren't extinct in any simple sense. Their empire is gone and their name has mostly been forgotten, but their descendants are still walking around, just wearing a different shape and a worse life. Call it a transformation instead of an extinction, because that's closer to what happened, and it might be the worst fate on this entire list. Nobody chooses to end up as a blind, twisted slave feeding on poison in the dark. The snow elves who took that deal didn't get wiped out. They got broken and kept alive, generation after generation, as something else. The Kothringi are a cleaner case. Nobody argues about what killed them. A disease did, and it did the job completely. The Kothringi were called the lustrous folk because their skin had a silver color to it, and they were native to Black Marsh. For a long time, they were thought to be the only humans truly native to Tamriel, though that turned out to be wrong once historians found other tribes who'd lived there just as long. The Kothringi are believed to descend from the Nedes, the broad human population that spread across much of Tamriel in the Merethic and First Eras, and their presence in Black Marsh goes back further than any written record. They didn't wear much in the way of clothes, preferring to go naked even when other cultures found that strange. But they were skilled crafters, known for chimes made of tin and copper, drums carved from hollow logs, and complicated woven mats and abacuses. Music mattered a great deal to them. They worshipped a god of hard work named Zen, along with Dibella, Mara, and Kynareth, and there's some evidence they worshipped Clavicus Vile before that. Long before any of that, the Kothringi fought a quiet war with the Argonians of a settlement called Hismir, far enough back that little survives about how it started or ended. The Argonians feared the Kothringi could turn something called Zot stones against them, and whatever happened, Hismir stayed in Argonian hands. Kothringi craftsmanship went well past music. They wove reeds of different colors into decorative mats, built portable abacuses that used varnished sphere scarabs as beads, and made dream catchers that were still turning up around Tamriel long after the people who made them were gone. They buried their dead in cairns decorated with glass beads, some of which doubled as wearable instruments, and some residents of Gideon, a city built on old Kothringi land, still claim to feel Kothringi spirits lingering there. Treasure hunters keep poking around those same ruins, looking for whatever Kothringi wealth might still be buried. They were also sailors, and this is the detail that matters most to their ending. Kothringi ships were unusual, built with a shallow draft that let them move through both swamp water and open sea, and they sailed as far as Hammerfell. Some sources believe the Kothringi were the ones who carried the Knahaten flu out of Black Marsh by ship, spreading it to Valenwood and the provinces nearby. That disease started in the city of Stormhold in the year 560 of the Second Era, and it killed every single non-Argonian who caught it. Argonians were immune, which is part of why some blamed them for starting it in the first place, through some kind of manipulation of the hist trees, though there's also a natural origin theory, and even a claim that the Aelids created it as a weapon aimed specifically at the Kothringi. Nobody has ever settled which of those is true. The disease itself was as ugly as its death toll suggests. It started with plain tiredness and a loss of appetite, moved into aching muscles, chills, and watering eyes, and finished with a racking cough, high fever, and blood running from the nose, eyes, and mouth. A red, granular rash spread across the whole body along the way, one that didn't itch but marked a person as infected all the same, and some victims lost the ability to speak entirely before the end came. Most people who caught it were dead within 3 days, though a few managed to hold on for as long as a week. Argonians, who mostly shrugged the flu off, sometimes called it, almost gently, the half-swim sniffles, a name that undersells what it did to nearly everyone who wasn't them. All told, the flu burned through Tamriel for 43 years, from 560 to 603 of the Second Era, before anyone was willing to call it finished. The flu reshaped Tamriel well beyond Black Marsh, too. It wiped out the royal family of Wayrest outright, ending their dynasty and clearing the way for a new king named Emmerich, whose rise eventually led to the alliance called the Daggerfall Covenant. In Elsewhere, it killed enough of the population that the Khajiit came away owing a real debt of gratitude to the Altmer who'd helped nurse the survivors, a debt that later factored into their decision to join the Aldmeri Dominion. In Black Marsh itself, the Flu did what centuries of fighting never managed and broke the Empire's grip on the province so completely that the Argonians who lived there ended up joining the Ebonheart Pact as equals instead of subjects. A disease that erased one people from the world ended up redrawing the political map for everyone left standing around them. Not every people the Flu struck ended up as empty as Black Marsh did, either. In Elsewhere, a number of Khajiit survived their own infection and went on living, scarred and shunned by their own neighbors, in a canyon they came to share together as outcasts, known ever after as the Stricken. Whatever the reason, Kotringi bodies didn't get the same second chance Khajiit bodies did. That difference alone is most of why the Kotringi ended up gone for good, and the Khajiit, however diminished, didn't. The disease didn't stay contained to Black Marsh either. It crossed the sea to Elsewhere and Valenwood and even reached the shores of High Rock, sweeping up whole other populations along the way, but nowhere did it hit as hard or as permanently as it hit the Kotringi on their own home ground. Whatever started it, the Flu tore through the Kotringi's home territory and killed almost everyone. Their settlements of Stillrise Village and Zook were already empty within a year of the outbreak reaching them. Imperial scholars eventually just wrote the Kotringi off as extinct. One story from that time gets repeated more than any other: the Crimson Ship. It left Black Marsh in the year 563 of the Second Era, packed with Kotringi refugees fleeing the Flu, and it was turned away at every port it tried. After a year at sea, it reached Hammerfell, and finding no one willing to take them in there either, it turned west into open water and was never seen again by anyone whose account survives as reliable. There are legends of people spotting the ship later, adrift, but the tale of pirates finding it with everyone aboard dead reads like fiction, and no official record backs it up. A Khajiit beggar once claimed his own ship crossed paths with it, but his story doesn't hold up well either. To this day, Hammerfell marks the anniversary with something called the Day of Shame, and on that day, nobody leaves their house because the story says the Crimson Ship comes back. The Flu almost came back for real, centuries after it supposedly burned itself out. In the year 427 of the Third Era, a lich named Gedna Relvel, once a sorceress who'd cheated death by turning herself into an undead thing, broke free of her own tomb in Mournhold and tried to spread the same plague through the city by infecting rats with it. She was destroyed before the disease could spread past a handful of victims. It's a small footnote in a much larger story, but it says something about how much fear the Knahaten Flu still carried hundreds of years later, long after it had already finished off the one people it's actually credited with wiping out completely. A few Kotringi did survive, though not through anything that looks like an escape. The chief of Stillrise Village struck a desperate bargain with the Daedric Prince Clavicus Vile to save his people from the Flu, and Vile kept his end of it in the cruelest way available. He turned the entire village into undead skeletons, immortal and disease-proof, hiding their true nature behind illusion magic until the truth came out generations later. In the nearby settlement of Zook, one man became immune by absorbing the power of a magical keystone, at the cost of the stone eventually killing him if it were ever taken from him. None of that reads like survival in any ordinary sense. It reads like a disease so total that staying alive required becoming something other than what they'd been. There's a stranger footnote to their story from centuries earlier. A Kotringi knight named Zook served in the imperial garrison of Gideon and grew close to Empress Tavia, wife of Riemann III, the last ruler of the Riemann dynasty. Tavia conspired with Zook to assassinate her own husband, and after Riemann III was killed, Lord Zook went home to Shadowfen and founded a town that still carries his name today. That's a strange thing to be remembered for. A people who built shipping routes, wove intricate mats, and carved bone harps, and one of the more durable pieces of their legacy is a town named after a man tangled up in killing an emperor. The Kothringi may also be connected to a separate tribe called the Kothri, Nedic slaves herded by the Aelids in the early First Era, though the link between the two names is more of a guess based on similarity than a documented fact. Around the year 582 of the Second Era, a scholar with the University of Gwillim's Antiquarian Circle tracked down and reassembled the scattered pieces of a magical Kothringi hunter's garment, one of the few near-complete Kothringi artifacts known to survive into modern times. And in Gideon, built partly on old Kothringi land, the Nibenes still share the local Kothringi's old devotion to Dibella, with the house of Dibella standing at the center of the city's main street to this day. The Kothringi are the plainest example on this list of a people simply killed, not betrayed into something else, not faded away over centuries, just killed, fast, by a disease nobody can fully explain the origin of, carried by the very ships that were once a source of Kothringi pride. The Nedes lasted a lot longer than the Kothringi, and died out in a much slower, messier way. The Nedes were a human people, or maybe a group of related races, spread across much of Tamriel through the Merethic era and the First Era. Where they actually came from is disputed, and the sources are honest about that. One theory says they were native to Tamriel from the start. Another says they migrated from Atmora, the same place the Nords came from. Nobody has settled which one is right, and the word Nede itself gets used so broadly for any human tribe from that period that some scholars consider it almost useless as a label, since it covers cultures as different from each other as Reachmen and Redguards. Their strongest foothold was in Hammerfell, which they called the Deathlands. There, a Nedic society called the Duraki thrived for centuries, built around something called the Cult of the Stars, which was exactly what it sounds like. Worship of the constellations and beings called the Celestials, studied and prayed to in equal measure. Some of that worship got surprisingly literal. The Duraki built things called apex stones, using knowledge they'd apparently taken from the Dwemer, specifically meant to pull those Celestials down out of the sky and let them walk around in the mortal world for a while. Nobody today can really explain how that was supposed to work, only that the Nedes believed it did. The Duraki built their cities out of stone and were skilled at it, though almost none of that stonework survives, since later conquerors either tore it down or built over it. They faced invasion after invasion. Both the Aelids and the Dwemer moved into their territory at different points, and both dismissed the Duraki as backward savages, which gave them a convenient excuse to subjugate people who'd actually built working cities long before either group showed up. The Duraki also lived next to the Iron Orcs, a primitive stone-worshipping people, and while the two groups clashed plenty, there were also stretches where they got along fine. Duraki legend includes a strange episode called the Autumn of Snakes, when hundreds of mammoth-sized snakes supposedly rose out of the ground and swallowed whole towns before a spear maiden named Ranev the Coal-Eyed Wanderer finally subdued them and earned the title Favored of the Stars. Nedic scholars wrote about the autumn in careful, nearly identical detail across many separate accounts, and yet the event itself is considered entirely made up. That's worth noting on its own. A whole scholarly tradition built careful documentation around something that never happened at all. The Duraki were led by a council of 9 kings, each one tied to a different practice of magic, from the Blood King to the Storm King, all of them under a single High King named Durak. That council fell apart from the inside before the Yokudans ever arrived. An advisor named Virmaril the Betrayer murdered the whole council of Nedic kings, which meant the Duraki were already leaderless by the time the most vicious Yokudan warband, the Ankara, showed up under Emperor Tarish Z, to finish the job. Elsewhere, Nedic tribes lived under elven rule across most of Tamriel, in a subordinate position more often than not. In High Rock, the Nedes who settled there eventually became known as the Proto-Bretons, ruled by a line of druidic kings under the elven Direni clan. The Direni had a formal rite, called the Perquisite of Coation, to sleep with any Nede they chose, and the children born from those unions became a new class of mixed people who eventually turned into the modern Bretons. In Cyrodiil, the Nedic population lived under the much crueler rule of the Daedra-worshipping Aelids, who staged raids to capture and enslave them, forcing them into agricultural work and worse. That oppression is what eventually produced the Alessian Slave Rebellion in the year 242 of the First Era, when the slave queen Alessia led an uprising that freed every slave in the Aelid Empire and founded a new human nation in Cyrodiil. By then, centuries of enslavement and mixing with other conquered races had already worn down anything that could be called a distinct Nedic culture in Cyrodiil, and what remained became the ancestors of the modern Imperials. Part of what kept Nedic resistance alive under the Aelids was a mysterious figure named Shazar, remembered in Nedic folklore less as a warrior than as a teacher, someone who passed along stoneworking, soul magic, or stolen Aelid battle secrets, depending on which tribe told the story. That inspiration is credited with sustaining Nedic resistance all the way through to Alessia's own rebellion centuries later. A handful of individual Nedes survive by name rather than just as tribes. Cadwell, a self-serving knight remembered as a betrayer, Huna, the lover of the champion Pelinal Whitestrake and one of the fighters in the Alessian rebellion, and Lamai Beolfag, a priestess of Arkai who was transformed into the very first vampire, an origin story that ties one of Tamriel's most enduring monsters back to an ordinary Nedic woman. In Morrowind, Nedic tribes clashed violently with the early Chimer. The largest of these tribes, the Rontha, invaded the region now called Stonefalls, refused every attempt at a peaceful settlement, and caused a great deal of death before a group known as the Brothers of Strife finally stopped them, at real cost to the Chimer. In Skyrim, Nedic tribes lived a more nomadic life, worshipping the god Arkai instead of the Atmoran god Orki, and were known for skilled metalwork, even though their culture overall was considered more primitive than their cousins elsewhere. Other Nedic tribes are only really remembered by name. The Purana studied the stars in Cyrodiil and Hammerfell alike, and 3 of their number, called the Eternal Watchers, were responsible for locking away a figure named Virmaril the Betrayer, the same advisor whose treachery would later gut the Duraki Council of Kings. The 1,000-strong of Sedor were enslaved by the Aelids and later freed by the champion Pelinal Whitestrake. The men of Ge, another enslaved Aelid tribe, were eventually wiped out entirely when an Aelid ruler called the Flower King made a sacrifice to a long-forgotten insect god on their behalf. None of those tribes left behind much more than their names and a line or two about how they died. Out west, on the Isle of Herne, Nedes had already been fighting off elves for generations before the Yokudans ever arrived. Their war chief Hakon led a courageous defense of the island, but it wasn't enough. When the first Yokudan warrior wave landed there on its way to the mainland, it wiped out Hakon's people entirely, making Herne one of the very first Nedic populations the Yokudans erased outright instead of just displacing. Nedic culture didn't end in one battle or one plague. It wore down over centuries, the way a coastline erodes, as one Nedic group after another got absorbed into the culture of whoever conquered or outmarried them. The final blow came from the east. In the year 808 of the First Era, the Yokudans arrived in Hammerfell as an invading force called the Ragada, and they moved through the region with brutal speed, killing or enslaving everyone in their path. The Duraki prayed to their stars as they always had, and this time the prayers didn't help. Their kings fell one by one, and the remaining Nedes retreated to the remote region of Craglorn, where a particularly brutal band of Yokudan invaders, led by an emperor named Tarish Z, caught up with them and finished the job. By the 9th century of the First Era, Nedic culture as a distinct thing was confined to memory. Even after all that, Nedic influence never fully disappeared. Much of Nedic religion, custom, and language got absorbed by the very people who wiped them out, the Red Guards. And in Nibenai, old Nedic tradition survived well enough that the people there are sometimes called the closest thing left to a pure-blooded Nede. So the Nedes were killed off as a distinct culture, mostly by the Yokudan invasion, but the ending was less a single blow than the last stage of a long decline that had already been running for centuries. Akavir is where this list gets truly murky, because almost nothing about it is settled. Akavir is the continent east of Tamriel, and Tamrielic scholars admit outright that most of what they know about it is either incomplete or flat out wrong. It has 4 nations, each with its own race, the Tsaiski, the Kamel, the Kapotun, and the Tangmo. No Mer have ever lived there, as far as anyone knows. That part of the record is consistent. What isn't consistent is what happened to the men who did. The Kamal are sometimes called snow demons, freezing solid through the winter and thawing out to attack their neighbors, the Tangmo, every summer, always without success. The Kapotun are tiger-like catfolk ruled by a figure named Tosh Raka, who is said to have transformed himself into an actual dragon, and they consider the Tsaiski their greatest rivals. The Tangmo are a generous, brave, and somewhat chaotic monkey folk who have spent their whole history fending off every other Akaviri nation's attempts to conquer them, and have so far always managed it. All 4 of those nations still exist today, and none of them belong on a list like this one. The only real mystery on Akavir is what happened to the men who used to live there before the Tsayeski rose to dominate the continent. One source calls the Tsayeski a race of men outright. Another source says something very different, that the men who once lived on Akavir were all eaten long ago by the Tsayeski, the serpent folk who now dominate the continent. The word eaten isn't a figure of speech in this context, or at least it might not be, and the source that uses it admits the claim can be interpreted in many ways. The same source adds an odd detail on top of that. The serpent folk are also said to resemble the men they supposedly ate. That's not the kind of thing a source says when it's confident. It reads exactly like what it is, a legend nobody has managed to pin down, repeated because it's the best anyone has. The Tsayeski themselves are hard to classify past that point too. Some sources call them a race of men, others call them beast folk. Every actual encounter with them on record shows something at least humanoid, and some individual Tsayeski are described as indistinguishable from ordinary humans, which only adds to the confusion since it raises the possibility that they're shapeshifters on top of everything else. They have black hair as a consistent trait, and some accounts give them scaly feet or tails, or describe their bodies as resembling inverted gorgons. Legends about where they actually came from disagree with each other just as badly. Some say that Tsayeski's own ancestors fell prey to a vampiric serpent race that came before them. Others say those ancestors weren't eaten at all, just captured. And there's a separate claim, stranger still, that the human-looking Akaviri who later turned up in Tamriel weren't really Tsayeski at all, just surviving humans of Akavir who'd ended up serving the serpent folk as servitors, wearing something close to their old faces while working for their conquerors. None of that gets resolved anywhere in the record. It's presented again and again as competing legend rather than settled fact, and that's the honest state of it. Whatever happened to the original human population of Akavir, whether they were eaten, enslaved, absorbed, or simply pushed aside by a race that came to resemble them, nobody alive can say for certain. and the sources that survive don't even agree with each other closely enough to narrow it down. What is on firmer ground is how Akavir and Tamriel have dealt with each other since. Akaviri raiders and pirates showed up along Tamriel's coasts for centuries before any full invasion, and the biggest and best documented invasion came in the year 2703 of the First Era, when a Seshi armada landed and cut a bloody path through Morrowind and Skyrim before getting stopped at Pale Pass by the forces of Riemann. In one of the stranger turns in Tamrielic history, the entire Tsaiski army surrendered to Riemann once he reached them, kneeling and saying they had found what they'd come to Tamriel seeking, which most read as an acknowledgement of Riemann himself as the Dragonborn they'd been hunting for. Many of those Tsaiski joined Riemann's own forces afterward, forming the Dragon Guard, and their influence on Tamrielic warfare, armor, and even the later founding of the Blades runs deep enough that most of the Empire's aesthetic around dragons and Eastern-style armor traces straight back to them. Akavir sent one more army west centuries later, though this time it wasn't the Tsaiski. In the year 572 of the Second Era, an army of Kemal landed near Windhelm under a king named Adasum-dir Kemal, and sacked the city before marching south into Morrowind. They never made it back out. A Dunmer army under Almalexia and a Nord army under Prince Jorun boxed them in on a beach that came to be known afterward as Vivek's Antlers. A phalanx of Argonian soldiers joined the fight at nearly the last possible moment, and Vivek himself is said to have finished the slaughter with a tidal wave that drowned whatever was left. It's one more Akaviri invasion of Tamriel, and one more that ended in near total destruction rather than conquest on either side of the water. What can be said about Tsaiski society itself comes almost entirely from their time in Tamriel, since so little of Akavir proper has ever been documented firsthand. Ancestor worship runs through everything they do, built on a belief that waterways connect the worlds of the living and the dead, letting ancestor spirits watch their descendants and reward or punish them, depending on how their lives turn out. Once a year, during something called the Proving Festival, participants prove their wisdom, strength, and honor to those watching spirits through 3 separate tests. A community of Imperials claiming Tsaiski descent, the Rimmen of Hakoshai, still keeps that festival alive today, right down to setting paper lotuses adrift on a river to catch the attention of the dead. Beyond ancestor worship, the Tsayeshi recognize at least 4 elemental gods: Ilni for weather and air, Min for sun and fire, Nifa for earth, and Zisa for oceans and water. Their artistic tradition, called the Serpentine Ways of Making, survived their exodus from Cyrodiil only in a diluted form, though a few real examples of it still stand in Tamriel, like the Tonenaka Shrine in Riemann, a building whose construction was funded by the wealth Tsaiski refugees brought with them when they resettled the city. Riemann himself leaned into that Akaviri influence rather than erase it, blending elements of their culture into Cyrodiil alongside Colovian and Nibonese traditions. And it was an Akaviri named Dinieras Ves who first proposed what eventually became the Fighters Guild. Centuries later, Akaviri surnames are still treated as something close to a prize among Cyrodiilic nobility, and traces of Akaviri features still turn up in a handful of old, distinguished Cyrodiilic families. A small, quiet reminder of a people whose original fate on their own continent nobody has ever fully explained. The Tsaiski who'd settled into Riemann's service didn't stay confined to the ranks either. Several of them rose all the way to become potentates, rulers of the Second Empire in their own right, once the Riemann dynasty itself finally died out at the end of the First Era. 2 of those potentates, Versidushay and Savirian Korak, ruled outright for a stretch known as the Akaviri Potentate, before assassination ended both of their lines in turn. A people whose original fate on their own continent stays this unresolved somehow still ended up, for a time, sitting on the ruby throne itself. Akaviri weaponry left just as deep a mark on Tamriel as Akaviri warriors did. The katana, the tanto, and the wakizashi all came west with the tsaeski, and members of House Telvanni still prefer enchanted tantos specifically for how well the blades hold a spell. Two swords tied to the tsaeski, called Dawnfang and Duskfang, along with a third named Bloodthirst, are said to carry something of their creator's bloodthirsty reputation baked right into the metal. There's one more loose thread in the Akaviri record worth mentioning, since it fits the pattern of this whole stop. Early accounts describe Akaviri people with rat-like features, and others with a canine look, distinct from the Tsaeski, the Kamal, the Kapotun, or the Tangmo. Nobody has ever identified what those cultures actually were, and the sources themselves suggest they may simply be extinct, or just displaced, without offering anything more specific than that. Even the edges of Akavir's history stay this unresolved, so this fourth stop doesn't really end, it stays open. Whatever happened to the original men of Akavir sits right alongside the Kothringi, the Nedes, and the corrupted half of the Snow Elves, as a people who were killed, or eaten, or something in between that the sources themselves can't agree on. That unresolved quality isn't a gap waiting to be filled in later. It's the actual state of the record, and it may never close. Those four races were killed, or eaten, or something in between the sources can't even agree on. The next few didn't go out that way at all. No war finished them off. No plague swept through and got blamed for it. They just stopped, quietly, and left barely a trace behind. The Lilmothit are the clearest example of that. They were a foxfolk people, nomadic and tribal, native to Blackmarsh, and some scholars think they were related to the Khajiit of elsewhere, though that's a guess, not a settled fact. They founded the settlements of Lilmoth and Blackrose and held the southern coast of the province as their own territory for a long stretch of time. When elven invaders came through, a related people called the Fauns fought back against them. The Lilmothit made a different choice. They hid, taking their kits with them rather than standing and fighting. It worked for a while, but the Lilmothit kept declining anyway, generation after generation, with no single event anyone can point to as the cause. They pulled back from the coasts toward the inland region around Blackrose, and by the Second Era, they were scarcely seen at all. Scholars from High Rock came to believe that whatever handful of Lilmothit still lived around Lilmoth were finished off by the Knahaten flu, the same disease that killed the Kothringi, though even that is more of an educated guess than a documented fact. What's left of them today is thin, a children's toy shaped like a fox, named after them, and not much else. They didn't leave behind ruins the way the Aelids or the Dwemer did. They didn't leave songs the way the Snow Elves killers did. They just stopped showing up in the record, and the record itself barely noticed. The Orma are even thinner than that. They were a tribe of men native to Blackmarsh, mentioned in the old sources alongside three other tribes, the Horwali, the Kothringi, and the Yespest. Of those four names, only the Kothringi got a real history written down anywhere. The Horwali and the Yespest appear as names and nothing else. No story, no fate, just a mention that they existed alongside the others. That's worth saying plainly instead of filling in a guess, because the honest state of the record here really is that thin. The Orma themselves have one strange and specific trait. They were born without eyes. Their skulls didn't have eye sockets at all, and in place of sight they became masters of touch and their other senses. Nobody knows how they ended up in Blackmarsh in the first place. The best guesses on offer are that they were sent there as refugees or as prisoners, or that they simply settled the coastal waterways on their own and adapted to a hard environment over time. None of those guesses is confirmed. The Orma lived in Argonia through the First and Second Eras, and by the late Third Era, they were considered gone from the province entirely. No war did it. No plague got blamed for it. They just weren't there anymore. Two concrete traces of them survive. One is an Orma skull, used as a door marker for a room holding powerful artifacts in Skorg Barrow, of all places. The other is a woman named Kachika, one of the few named Orma on record, who served with Riemann's army at Caer Suvio when Prince Ulek Serodil was poisoned before the battle at Bodrum, and who later worked at a resort in Nibelheim, helping to falsely implicate the emperor's mistress in a plot against him. That's the entire recorded legacy of an entire people, a skull nailed to a door, and one woman mixed up in an imperial poisoning scandal. Whatever happened to the rest of them, it left almost nothing behind. The left-handed elves went out in a war so big that most people have never even heard of it. They called themselves the Kanuriyai, and Tamrielic scholars know them mostly as the Sinistral Mer, or just the left-handed elves, a people native to Yokuda, the continent that would later sink beneath the ocean. They fought the Yokudans for something like 1,000 years, and their empire, the Left-Hand Empire, is said to have been 4 times the size of the Third Empire under Tiber Septim, which was, at its height, all of Tamriel. That number alone gives some sense of the scale of what the Yokudans were actually up against. For a long stretch, the Yokudans couldn't even agree among themselves on who should lead the fight. Their ruling council, the Nato Tambu, argued and stalled, because the swordmasters who might have led a unified war effort were all matched so evenly in a dueling style called the best known cuts, that no clear victor ever emerged, and without a clear victor, nobody had standing to take command. That standoff broke when a figure named Leki stepped in and introduced a new move, the ephemeral feint, which finally let one swordmaster win outright. Only then did the Yokudans have a leader they'd accept, and only then did they formally declare war on the left-handed elves. Even with a leader in place, the war might have dragged on the way it had for centuries, except for one more intervention. Diagna, an avatar of the Yokudan god known as the Hunding, brought Orichalk weapons to the Yokudan side, and those weapons turned out to be decisive. Swordmasters called Yansei carried them into battle, and it was their blades that finally drove the left-handed elves into the ocean, ending the 1,000-year war in Yokuda's favor. The Yokudans didn't get to enjoy that victory in peace for long. Their own continent fell into a series of wars afterward that eventually destroyed it completely, which is a separate and much larger story. The left-handed elves themselves didn't all go into the sea and stay there. Some remnants survived and turned up later in the Sistres archipelago, arriving around the year 660 of the First Era, with the intent of conquering the islands from the native Breton druids who lived there. They built a fortress on the island of Amenos and fought a long, grinding siege against the rest of the archipelago, killing hundreds of fighters on both sides without ever managing to finish the job. The siege only ended when Mount Firesong erupted in the year 676 of the First Era, killing druids and elves together in the same disaster. What was left of the left-handed elves held onto the Sistres after that, but not for long. A little over 100 years later, the first wave of Yokudan warriors, the Ragada, arrived in the Sistres too, hunting for new land, and wiped out what remained of the starving, left-handed elf population before moving on to conquer Hammerfell. The Red Guards who descend from those Yokudan warriors don't talk about the left-handed elves much anymore. Bringing up the details is said to only darken the day. What little is known of left-handed elf culture comes down mostly through Yokudan and Druidic sources, which makes it a second-hand picture at best. They used a reptile called the Yath asp for leather, prized for how well it resisted cuts, and wrapped it specifically around the torso, which they believed held the throne of the soul. They ran onyx mines on Hatu Mountain and were considered gifted gem cutters, right up until the Yokudans seized those same mines as spoils of war. A rare alloy called Singer Steel, mixing steel with a small amount of orichalcum, may have come from left-handed elf smiths working with orichalc captured during the fighting, One surviving text, Cries from Empty Mouths, gives a rare glimpse of what they might actually have believed. There is bone and dirt, blood and smoke, flesh and metal. This is the real. Knowing this makes our people strong. We tell no stories for comfort, so we fight to stay in the here and now. Even whether they were elves at all gets argued over. Some scholars think the whole label came from a Yokudan translation error where the words for elf and enemy sounded close enough to get mixed up, meaning the so-called left-handed elves might never have been elves in the first place, just enemies who happened to fight left-handed. Druidic texts describing them as long of face and long of ear push back against that reading, though those same texts also describe them using shields in battle, which runs against everything else known about Yokudan military habits and only muddies the question further. By the middle of the Second Era, their memory had faded enough that peddlers in Tamriel were selling fake Sinistral cutlery sets to gullible buyers, claiming ordinary tableware once belonged to an ancient elven dinner service. A people whose empire was 4 times the size of the entire Third Empire had been reduced, within a few centuries, to a punchline for con artists. Whether the left-handed elves are truly gone for good is itself disputed. Some scholars think there may be a connection between them and the modern Maormer, the sea elves of Piandonea, though that's speculation, not established fact. Funerary urns found in the Sistres, made from unusually pure orichalcum and decorated with winged figures, are thought by some to be remnants of Sinistral elf culture, though nobody can confirm that either. Whatever the truth, this is a people driven into the ocean by war, scattered, chased down a second time generations later, and only maybe surviving today under a completely different name in a completely different place. If that connection to the Maormer is real, then the left-handed elves belong less with the killed and more with the transformed. Nobody really knows for sure. The Drow are the strangest entry on this list, because if the legend about them is true, their extinction didn't even happen inside history. Today, Drow are aquatic, octopus-like beastfolk, hunted mainly for their hide and for the wax that can be scraped off their shells. They're immune to poison, disease, and paralysis, resistant to magic, and can regenerate wounds in darkness or underwater, though they don't handle frost well. Most of them live simple lives along the coasts of Tamriel, scavenging for food, and some colonies still keep a rough kind of order under rulers called Trident Kings. None of that sounds like the remnant of a lost empire. Legend says that's exactly what they are. According to that legend, the Drow once ruled the entire world as tyrant kings from a domain called Lig, enslaving the oceans under their rule. Molag Bal himself is said to have served as their chief in that era, wearing a form that closely resembled his own followers instead of the shape he's usually shown in now. That story comes down through several different traditions, but the clearest version of it comes from the teachings of Mankar Camoran, who claim that Lig and the Drow's entire tyranny were destroyed by Mehrunes Dagon in the Kalpa before this one, the version of the world that came before the one Tamriel exists in now. If that's accurate, then whatever happened to the Drew's old empire isn't an extinction that occurred somewhere in Tamriel's history at all. It's a survival from before history even started, carried over into a new world as scavengers who used to be kings. Mankar Camoran is not a source anyone should take at face value. He was the leader of the mythic Dawn cult, a heretic by any mainstream standard, and his teachings exist specifically to justify worship of Mehrunes Dagon. Whatever he says about Lig being destroyed by his own patron prince needs to be read as exactly what it is. Myth filtered through the mouth of a cult leader with an obvious reason to tell that particular version of the story. It's worth repeating that this is myth and heresy, not settled record. Interestingly, a similar story shows up in Khajiit mythology, completely independent of Camoran's teachings, describing a fight between a figure called the demon cat Dagon and a demon king named Molag. Two very different cultures landed on stories that rhyme with each other, which doesn't prove either version is true, but it does suggest there's some older, shared root underneath both tellings that neither one fully preserved. Whatever the Drow actually were, they've had real dealings with the mortal races since. Ancient Khmer legends speak of the Drow as the Altmer of the sea, treacherous rulers of castles built from glass and coral, and tribunal mythology ties them into stories about Vivek's birth and his complicated relationship with the sea. In the year 1703 of the First Era, a group of Drow even allied briefly with Vivek against the Tsaiski invasion, fighting from behind Akaviri lines alongside the Dunmer. That's a strange kind of comeback for a people whose old empire, if the legend is true, was wiped out before the current version of the world even began. Their relationship with the Dunmer soured badly after that. Tribunal mythology holds that the Drow broke a promise made to Vivek involving a strange carapace called the Ruddy Man, and that Vivek never trusted them again afterward, supposedly creating Nyx hounds specifically to hunt them down. Pilgrims visiting the Shrine of Valor, built on the site of that old betrayal, are still told that the Ruddy Man was the father of all Drow, and that Vivek spared his life only on the condition that Drow give up their tough hides to be worn as Dunmer armor ever since. Whether that story is literal or just a colorful way of explaining why Dunmer hunt Drow for their hide isn't something the sources settle either way. Whatever they used to be, Drow today get hunted for reasons that have nothing to do with old legends. Their wax goes into candles, boot polish, and bottle stoppers. Their claws get carved into knives and ornaments, and their meat reportedly tastes something like lobster. A people that supposedly once enslaved the oceans of the entire world now mostly ends up as candle wax and boot polish, and that gap alone is part of why the old legend about Lig is so hard to take as settled fact. Even now, Drow keep a little of their old strangeness. Land Drow, sometimes called Billies, spend a single year of their life cycle on shore as aggressive, armored creatures built to breed, before returning to the water and settling back into their milder, scavenging habits. Both forms can channel a jolt of shock energy through their bodies when threatened. As recently as the Second Era, a Drow known as the Ruddy Broodmother was terrorizing the roads around the Morrowind mining town before finally being hunted down and killed. A small, unglamorous end for a creature some pilgrims insisted was connected to the legendary Ruddy Man himself. Their whole life cycle runs on transformations scholars gave their own names to. The yearly change into a land Drow is called Karvinasim, and there's said to be a reverse version too, called Akarvina, where a land creature turns into something suited for the sea instead. When a Drow finishes its year on land, it goes through a process called Meph, digesting its own unneeded skin and organs, and bringing the rest back up as small, foul-smelling lumps called Grom, which sounds useless until someone discovered that boiling it makes a material that can be shaped into potion flasks tough enough to survive being dropped. Even something a droid throws away turned out to be worth collecting. Everything up to this point in the list is gone, in one form or another, whether by war, by disease, by slow decline, or by some destruction so old it happened before recorded history even started. The next few races on this list are different. They aren't gone at all, they've just been met all along under different names. Start with the Aldmer, because every elf on this entire list, and every elf alive on Tamriel today, descends from them. The Aldmer were the Protomere of the Merethic era, sometimes called the First Folk or the Elder Folk. They first settled Somerset and spread out from there across much of mainland Tamriel. Their skin is described as having a lustrous bronze color, and they're generally credited as the first technologically advanced civilization to rise on Nirn, though some scholars argue that honor really belongs to the Hist instead. Whatever the truth of that argument, the Aldmer built a refined, chivalric culture, developed a system of musical notation still hard to interpret today, and spread far enough that nearly every elven people known to Tamriel traces back to them in one way or another. Beastfolk ancestors of the Argonians and the Khajiit already lived in Tamriel by the time the Aldmer arrived, but later historians usually describe those earlier societies as aboriginal and pre-literate next to what the Aldmer had built. Whatever the fairness of that comparison, those earlier populations got pushed aside fairly quickly once the more organized, more heavily armed Aldmer started spreading across the mainland. According to legend, the Aldmer originally came from a distant homeland called Aldmeris, a lost continent nobody has ever located. Some sources go further than just saying it's lost and suggest the whole place might be allegorical instead of real, a story about origins instead of an actual location that could be pinned to a map. Some of those sources are said to include the Elder Scrolls themselves. That's a strange position for an entire people's founding legend to be in, a homeland that may just be a metaphor, believed in by descendants who still shape their whole identity around wanting to get back to it. As the Aldmer spread out across Tamriel, they split apart, culturally and physically, into the different elven races known today. The ones who stayed on Somerset became the Altmer, the High Elves. Migrants who settled in Valenwood became the Bosmer. Morrowind saw both Dwemer and later Chimer settlement. A separate group split off and became the Maormer. And in High Rock, Aldmeri settlers interbred with native Nedas to produce the Bretons. Every single branch of that splintering traces back to the same root population. Few individual Aldmer are remembered by name from that early period, but the handful who are tend to loom large. High Lord Torinan is credited as the first to settle Somerset. Topal the Pilot charted much of the rest of Tamriel and is remembered for trading literacy to a native people called the Birdmen in exchange for the island that would become the Imperial City. Orgnum, once an ordinary Aldmer, became the undying sorcerer king of the Maormer, ruling the Sea Elves his own people eventually splintered into. Even the necromancer Mani Marco, better known as the King of Worms, once insisted he wasn't simply an Altmer at all, but an Aldmer in the old original sense, which says something about how much status that ancestry still carries even among people willing to break every other rule of Tamrielic society. Some sources trace the entire splintering of the Aldmer to a realization about the magical towers scattered across Nirn, each tied to its own stone, capable of telling a different story about reality and shaping its own version of the world around it. Once different Aldmer factions started following different towers, the elves are said to have self-refracted, each to their own creation, with the Bosmer following the towers directly, the Chimer following something called Red Heart, and the Altmer following Crystal-like Law. Under that reading, the Altmer didn't just wander apart geographically. They split because they started believing different stories about the world, and each story pulled its followers a little further from where they'd all started. Modern Altmer are widely considered the closest living representation of what the original Aldmer actually looked like, both physically and culturally, and Altmer society reveres that ancestry heavily, sometimes to the point that some sources claim they selectively breed toward Aldmer-like features on purpose. Some Altmer songs are still composed in Old Altmeris, the ancient tongue of their forebears, kept alive specifically because of what it connects them to. So, when the word extinct gets applied to the Aldmer, it needs an asterisk attached immediately. Their original homeland might be nothing more than a story. Their original name barely gets used outside of scholarly or religious contexts anymore. But their blood, their culture, and their entire self-image are alive today in every Altmer, every Bosmer, every Mermer, and every Breton on Tamriel. A whole people defined by a homeland that may just be a metaphor didn't die out. It kept splitting and spreading until it became almost everyone. The Chimer are a more direct case of the same pattern, a people who still exist today, just under a new name and a new color. The Chimer, sometimes called the Changed Folk, were Aldmeri dissidents who abandoned Somerset and made a long exodus to Morrowind, following a prophet named Veloth. Veloth acted on the word of Boethia, the Daedric prince of plots, and two other Daedra that Velothi tradition considers good. That teaching split off an entirely new culture from the Aldmer, dynamic, ambitious, and built around fundamentalist ancestor worship. The Chimer closely resembled the Altmer they'd left behind, though their skin carried a paler golden tone. Legend explains the split with a story that's downright strange even by the standards of Daedric mythology. Trinimac, the strongest of the early Aldmeri ancestor spirits, tried to stop Veloth's movement before it could take hold. Boethia responded by tricking Trinimac, swallowing him whole, and speaking to the gathered crowd using Trinimac's own stolen form and voice, discrediting his teachings from the inside. When Boethia was finished, the prince relieved himself of what remained of Trinimac in front of everyone, and according to the legend, that waste became the Daedric prince Malakath. The followers who'd sided with Boethia rubbed that substance on their own skin, and that act of changing their skin is what marks the actual beginning of the Chimer as a people, separate from the followers of Trinimac who instead became the first orcs. It's worth keeping Boethia's role brief here, since the story exists in its own right elsewhere, but it's the reason the Chimer exist as a distinct people at all. Not every follower of Boethia ended up in the same place. Legend says the crowd that watched Trinimac's transformation got split 3 ways after that. Mephala took a third of them southeast, since she alone wasn't afraid of the Hist, and that group became known as the Cantamiric Velothi. Azura took another third to the star-wounded east. Boethia kept the final third and led them toward a land that would eventually drift out into the ocean on its own, a piece of geography Dunmer theology says still has stories left to tell. Only the group that stayed closest to Boethia's own teaching became the Chimer, in the sense the word gets used today. Once in Morrowind, the Chimer built what's called the High Velothi culture, and quickly found themselves in conflict with the Nedis, the Orcs, and especially the Dwemer, who held a serious technological advantage over them despite the Chimer's skill with magic. That rivalry eventually gave way to an alliance, when Chimer leader Nerevar and Dwemer king Dumak joined forces to push the Nords out of Morrowind, and for a while afterward the two races lived side by side in real peace. That peace ended with the discovery of the Heart of Lorkhan and everything that followed from it, which gets its own full telling later in this list. Once settled, the Chimer developed quickly. They domesticated Quama for food, built up early farming settlements, and picked up real skill in magic, even while losing most of their fights with the more technologically advanced Dwemer. A few small threads of that original Chimer culture are said to survive even now, folded in among the Dunmer who replaced them. Dubious imperial records describe a tribal remnant called the Chimeri Quay, fisherfolk living along the coast of a place called Kathnoke in floating townships. And certain phrases still used to describe Dunmer royalty and tribunal art, like calling Queen Baranzaya a bronze daughter, or the bronze faces and bronze depictions tied to the old gods, are said by some to be a quiet callback to the bronze-toned skin the Chimer had before the curse ever touched them. Small physical traces of Chimer culture survive in ways most people never think about. King Helseth of Morrowind wore an ancient Chimer crown, 5 points curving inward around a central blade, that by his own time had come to mean simply 5 houses under one king, even though nobody alive could say for certain what it meant to the Chimer who first made it. Not every orc accepts the standard story about Trinimac's transformation either. A number of orcish believers hold that Trinimac was never truly devoured or cursed at all, that he tricked Boethia into believing the transformation had worked while secretly keeping his own essence intact and passing strength onto his followers, making the orcs, in their own telling, improved elves rather than accursed and lesser people. That belief runs counter to nearly everything the Kimmer's own descendants say happened, and nobody has ever settled which version, if either, is the real one. Even Malakath's own symbol, a crescent moon, gets read by some Dunmer as a quiet reference to the Curse of Shadow, their own private name for the moment the Chimer's skin changed for good, which suggests that whatever people believe about Trinimaq and Malakath, the Dunmer themselves never fully stopped thinking of the two stories as connected. What matters here is what happened to the Chimer immediately after that war. As punishment for a broken oath made by the tribunal, the Chimer's skin turned ash black and their eyes turned red. That change is called the Curse, and is the exact moment the Chimer stopped existing and the Dunmer began. It wasn't a war that ended them, and it wasn't a disease. It was a single, total transformation applied to an entire people's skin and eyes at once. Two figures are known to have kept their old Chimer appearance instead of changing along with everyone else. Almalexia resisted the transformation entirely and kept her Chimer skin tone. Vivek only partly resisted it, splitting his appearance down the middle between the old look and the new one, which is the reason Vivek is often described as looking like two people occupying one body at the same time. Everyone else changed completely, and modern Dunmer theology doesn't even universally treat the change as a punishment. Some Dunmer see their darker skin as a gift instead, marking their ascent alongside the living gods of the tribunal rather than a mark of shame, so the Chimer are gone in name only. Their descendants are the Dunmer, one of the major races of modern Tamriel, still practicing ancestor worship, still shaped by the same exodus and the same Daedric princes that built the Chimer in the first place. A whole people didn't vanish here. They just changed color and kept going under a different name. The Elnofey are the strangest ending on this entire list, because in a real sense they went extinct by turning into physics. The word Elnofey translates to earth bones in the old language called Elnofex. According to Elven myth, the Elnofey were spirits present at the very start of Nirn from the Dawn era, counted alongside the Hist as among the original inhabitants of the world, and considered the ancestors of every mortal race, man and mer alike. When the god of magic, Magnus, departed the newly made world along with most of the other spirits who'd helped build it, a smaller group chose to stay behind instead and keep working on Nirn so it would remain viable. Some of those spirits eventually became what's called the Elnofey properly, going on to have offspring who diminished generation after generation until they became the ordinary mortal races. Others made a different choice entirely. A separate strand of the same myth describes actual warfare among the Elnofey, rather than a peaceful choice to stay or leave. In that version, one group of Elnofey arrived on Nirn together with a large intact piece of their old homeland and lived there much as they always had, in a place that came to be called Old Elnofey. A second group scattered across the New World and had to wander for a long time before finding each other. When the wanderers finally reached Old Elnofey, its people didn't welcome them as kin. They saw them as fallen and corrupted by their time in the New World, and war broke out between the two groups. That war is said to have reshaped the entire face of Nirn, sinking huge stretches of land beneath new oceans and carving out the continents known today as Tamriel, Akavir, Atmora, and Yokuda. According to one version of that myth, the wandering Elnofey, who ended up scattered on Akavir specifically, are the ones whose descendants eventually became the Tsayeski, the serpent folk covered earlier on this list, which would make that whole unresolved mystery about what happened to the original men of Akavir a much smaller thread inside an even older, bigger one. Every human and mer alive today, under either telling of the myth, descends from the Elnofey who survived one version of that ending or the other. Those others are the ones properly called the Earthbones, and Y'ffre went first among them. Y'ffre gave up his own physical form completely, sacrificing it to establish the basic rules of nature and life on Nirn, laws that took the shape of stories, and those stories became the deep structure the Bosmer and several other races still build their whole religious life around. Y'ffre didn't die in any ordinary sense. He became the rule that things have a fixed shape at all, the very reason a tree stays a tree and a person stays a person, and that rule is a thing Bosmer priests called spinners still study and interpret to this day. Y'ffre is worshipped well past just the Bosmer. Altmer, Bretons, and even the snow elves covered earlier on this list counted him among their gods too, which means a figure now treated mostly as a Bosmer deity was once shared across races who otherwise had almost nothing in common. Bosmeri legend adds a gentle detail to his sacrifice. Y'ffre is said to have gained a kind of sight through the eyes of every bird and the reflection of every body of water on Nirn, seeing and hearing the whole world at once through the very laws he gave up his body to create. That's an extinction that isn't really an extinction. It's a transformation so complete that there's no body left to look for, no ghost, no descendants in the normal sense, because the Elnofi who chose this path didn't leave anything behind that resembles a person anymore. What they left behind is the physical law that makes the rest of the world work the way it does. According to some traditions, the Dwemer and the ancestors of the Bosmer learned how to bend or defy those laws specifically by observing the Elnofe in the act of setting them, which is part of why the Bosmer can still perform something called the Wild Hunt, unraveling the very shape Y'ffre gave to living things. Some accounts describe a group of lingering Elnofe spirits still present in Tamriel much later. In the Second Era, wandering giants called the Old Bones, who caused suffering just by existing and moving through inhabited land, and who eventually sought a true death by being completely forgotten, since a being remembered can't fully die. That detail matters here because it says something about how these spirits themselves seem to have understood their own condition. Even the Elnofi, who didn't sacrifice themselves into natural law, couldn't simply die the way a mortal does. They had to be forgotten first. There's a formal name for the moment all of this splintering actually happened, the Sundering of Aldmeris. According to that account, the descendants of the Elnofe who settled Tamriel broke apart into the Dwemer, called the Deep Ones, the Chimer, the Changed Ones, the Bosmer, the Green or Forest Ones, the Falmer, the Snow Ones, the Maormer of Piandonia, the Sea or Tropical Ones, the Altmer, the Elder or High Ones, and the left-handed elves of Yokuda, called simply the left-handed ones. Almost every people covered so far on this entire list traces back through that one splintering event, all the way down to the Elnofe sitting at the root of the whole family tree. Other lingering traces of the Elnofe turn up in stranger corners of Tamriel. A coven of witches called the Beldama Word venerate a set of elemental spirits called the Guardians, who claim to be Elnofe that were once Y'ffre himself, still watching over an ancient, glowing oak called the Word Tree. Some sources also describe sea-dwelling Elnofi, said to have hearts made of pearl, living in old places where the earth's magic never fully settled down. None of that reads like a people that simply died. It reads like something that dissolved into the landscape itself in more than one place, more than once. It's worth keeping the actual Elnofe war brief here, since it's a story in its own right elsewhere. What matters for this list is the ending itself. A race whose disappearance wasn't a death, a fading, or even a transformation into some new form of body. It was a transformation into the rules that everything else in the world has had to follow ever since. The Elnofe went extinct by becoming the laws of nature, and every tree, every person, and every changing season on Nirn is, in a small way, still following the shape Y'ffre gave up his own life to set. The Aelids are a different kind of maybe not extinct than any of the races so far, because their case is really about missing evidence, not a confirmed ending. The Aelids, sometimes called the Heartland High Elves, were the first race to build an empire anywhere in Tamriel, ruling what's now Cyrodiil since before recorded history even starts. They founded the Imperial City and built the White Gold Tower itself, which they called the Temple of the Ancestors, built in direct emulation of an older structure called the Adamantine Tower. That's worth sitting with for a second. The seat of imperial power for every human empire that came after them was originally an Aelid temple. Aelid society began by honoring the Aedra, much like the Aldmer they descended from, but by the last millennium of the Merethic era, Daedra worship had taken hold across Cyrodiil and spread from mere tolerance into outright celebration. Unlike the Chimer, who drew a clear line between the Daedric princes they considered good and the ones they considered bad, the Aelids made no such distinction, and some of their kingdoms ended up worshipping outright monstrous patrons. They enslaved the native Nadic population of Cyrodiil on a massive scale, and in the worst of their kingdoms, that slavery came with real cruelty, including forced participation in what sources describe only as art tortures. A civil war called the Narfinsel Schism fought between the Daedra-worshipping majority and a smaller faction of Aelids, who had stayed loyal to the Aedra, ran from the late Merethic era into the First Era, and ended with those Aedra-worshipping Aelids driven into exile in Argonia, where they founded the settlements that became Gideon and Stormhold. That civil war is thought to have weakened the whole Aelid Empire badly, decades before Alessia's own rebellion ever started, and some of those same exiled Aedra-worshipping Aelid lords are the ones who later sided with Alessia once her rebellion began. That system finally broke with the Alessian slave rebellion in the year 242 of the First Era, when the slave Alessia rose up against her Aelid masters. Her champion, the nomad warrior Pelinal Whitestrake, killed the Aelid demigod king Umaril, the unfeathered inside White Gold Tower itself, though Pelinal died in the same fight, and the Aelids reportedly cut his body into 8 pieces afterward as a mockery of the number sacred to the divines. Alessia's rebellion succeeded within about a year, and the White Gold Tower fell into human hands for the first time. It's worth keeping the rebellion itself brief here, since it's a story that gets told fully elsewhere. What matters for this list is what happened to the Aelids after they lost. Even the smaller battles of that war showed how far Aelid magic could be pushed to survive. At Bravil, Aelid defenders used alteration magic to breathe underwater and hide beneath the Niben by day, coming out only at night to slaughter the besieging Alessian soldiers, and it took 4 separate assaults before the Alessian general finally caught on and broke them for good. They didn't disappear all at once. Aelid kingdoms held on in scattered pockets for a few hundred more years, in a stretch of history called the Late Aelid period, while the new human empire slowly hunted down and exiled any Aelids who wouldn't convert or leave. Many fled into Valenwood and High Rock, where they gradually got absorbed into the local elven populations, on the condition, in Valenwood's case, of adopting the Bosmer's Green Pact. A few clans held out in the Rothgarian mountains. Some scattered evidence even suggests certain Aelid tribes in Black Marsh were never touched by the Alessian armies at all, since their culture there had already drifted so far from the heartland Aelids that nobody has ever been able to say for certain how those particular settlements met their end, or whether they even did. Aelid magic ran on captured starlight. They built devices called Aelid wells out of fallen meteoric iron to harness it, and kept smaller pieces of meteoric glass called Welkin stones, and rarer ones called Varla stones, as portable stores of magical energy, some of which could even hold and play back memories for whoever read them. They were also obsessed with the number 8, a fixation that shows up constantly in their architecture and ritual, and some scholars think it shaped Alessia's own choice to build her new religion around 8 divines rather than some other number. 10 statues called the 10 Ancestors sat at the heart of Aelid faith, kept originally in the White Gold Tower before being scattered for safekeeping during the siege that ended their empire, not reunited again until long after the Aelids themselves were gone. One Aelid king's fate says something about how long these stories can run. King Diner, one of the last Aelid rulers to hold any real power, was lured back to his old home of Nenalata decades after fleeing it, walked straight into a trap set by Molag Bal, and ended up locked away in a specific cell inside Cold Harbor called the Lightless Oubliette. He stayed there for more than 3,000 years before an outside group finally broke in and freed him, and he didn't get to enjoy the freedom for long. He died soon after, inside a chapel belonging to the goddess Meridia, trying to help seal shut a Daedric portal that was threatening to swallow considerably more than just him. That's a strange kind of survival. An Aelid effectively frozen out of the world for 3 millennia while his entire race disappeared from view around him, only to return to a Tamriel that had long since stopped looking for people like him, and to die almost immediately after finally getting free of it. Whole Aelid cities are said to have vanished too, not just kings. The city of Varsa Baalim was built specifically to guard something called the Nefari Vigum, a trial built by the Daedric prince Mehrunes Dagon to test whoever wanted to claim his weapon, Mehrunes Razor. For generations, pilgrims came to Varsa Baalim hoping to pass that trial, and for generations the Aelids who ran the city turned every single one of them away, confident nothing could get past their defenses. Then, early in the First Era, a vampire slipped inside anyway. Undead spread through the streets, the city fell into chaos, and Varsa Baalim itself simply disappeared into the mountains of the eastern Nibelheim Basin. No one has ever explained what actually happened to it or the people living there. It's just gone, the same way whole races on this list are gone, except this time it was a single city instead of an entire race. Aelid enchanting was so thorough that imperial scholars centuries later assumed even the most ordinary Aelid household object carried some kind of spell worked into it. A prophecy attributed to the mysterious Moth-eyed foretold that Aelidic pride would bear bitter fruit, and by every account that survives, nobody in power at the time took the warning seriously enough to change anything. There's even said to be a secret society today, calling themselves Aelid Revivalists, dedicated to bringing the old Aelid Empire back. Whether that group is anything more than a rumor is its own open question, but its mere existence says something about how unfinished the Aelid story still feels to the people living in their old territory. What matters most is this. It's believed the Aelids still survive in the wilds of every province on Tamriel today, in small hidden tribes. Sightings of them have simply become rare. There have been no confirmed sightings at all recorded in either the 3rd or 4th eras. That's not the same thing as an extinction. That's an absence of evidence, and those are two different claims entirely. A people that nobody has spotted in centuries and a people that is actually gone would look identical from the outside, and there's no way from where things stand to tell which one the Aelids actually are. Their own motto, carved into the memory of a culture built entirely around lore and ancestry, was simple: wear lore as your armor. It's not a bad line to leave the Aelids on, since it's their own, and it says something true about a people whose fate really might just be that nobody has looked hard enough, in the right hidden corner of Tamriel, to find them still there. Dragons are next, and this is the one entry on the list where the actual extinction happens almost as an afterthought, after the war everyone remembers is already over. Dragons are called Dov or Dova in their own language, and Nordic legend holds that Akatosh made them in his own image, as his children, immortal and unchanging, attuned to the flow of time itself. For a long stretch of the Merethic era, a dragon named Alduin built something like a civilization among his own kind, and that leadership eventually extended to ruling over mankind as well. This is the part usually called the Dragon Cult, and it started in Atmora before moving south into Tamriel, where humans were governed with a much crueler hand than before. Alduin forsook the duties that came with that authority, and instead led the Dove to outright subjugate the mortal races beneath them, and under his rule, certain humans called Dragon Priests served as a kind of intermediate authority, with everyone else living under the heel of both. Eventually, the people underneath rebelled, and in that rebellion, mortals found ways to kill something that had always been considered undefeatable up to that point. Alduin's own brother and chief lieutenant, Parthurnax, is said to have taken pity on the Nords, reportedly at the urging of the goddess Kine, the Nordic goddess of storms, whom the Nords still call the Mother of Men, and he taught a handful of mortals how to use the dragon's own language against them, the technique called the Thuum. Those first mortal tongues used that stolen power to build a shout called Dragon Rend, strong enough to force an understanding of mortality into an immortal dragon's mind, and with the help of an Elder Scroll, they used it to cast Alduin out of time itself, rather than kill him outright. 3 of those tongues get named in the surviving accounts: Felder the Old, Hakon One Eye, and Gormlaith Golden Hilt. Before facing Alduin themselves, they tried to recruit a dragon priest named Mirak, the first person in history ever born with a dragon's own soul, since his unique nature would have given them a real edge. Mirak refused to help. The 3 fought Alduin alone instead, at the summit of a mountain called the Throat of the World, and it was Feldir who spoke the Elder Scrolls incantation that finally threw Alduin out of time. Centuries later, Emperor Riemann II had the whole story carved into a monument called Alduin's Wall, built inside a temple the Dragon Guard controlled, meant as a warning to future generations that Alduin's return was a certainty, not just a possibility worth planning around. That's the part of the story everybody knows. What comes after it is the actual extinction, and it gets much less attention. Once Alduin was gone, the dragons who remained and refused to show any loyalty to the mortal races who'd just beaten their leader were hunted down and slaughtered in large numbers. That's the moment that actually cleared the world of dragons, not the fight against Alduin himself, and it's described plainly as clearing the way for the many empires that have risen and fallen across Tamriel ever since. Dragons that survived scattered into remote mountain lairs, and centuries later, in Akavir, the serpent folk called the Tsaiski hunted their own dragon population nearly to extinction as well, driving many of the survivors back across the sea to Tamriel in the process. That Akaviri hunt didn't happen all at once. The Tsaiski first tried to consume every dragon on their own continent, and where they couldn't kill one outright, they enslaved it instead, breaking red dragons in particular to serve as war mounts. The black dragons escaped that fate by fleeing to the land of the tiger people, the Kapotun, and the resulting war between the Tsaiski and the tiger people is what finished off almost the entire Akaviri dragon population, red and black alike, long before the Tsaiski ever set foot in Tamriel. By the time the Akaviri Dragon Guard formed under Emperor Riemann, hunting dragons had become close to an institution in its own right, and generations of hunters after Riemann kept at it long after his reign ended. Dragons were widely believed to be fully extinct by the late Second Era. Dragons vary a lot in color and strength, and the color usually says something about how dangerous a given one is. Brown and green blood dragons tend to be the weakest, white frost dragons and bronze elder or ancient dragons considerably stronger, and the rarest. Most powerful dragons of all are said to have strange compound eyes unlike anything else in their kind. Dragon culture runs on a mix of pride and caution. They value strength and feel a nearly unstoppable urge to dominate whatever's around them, yet their own sayings warn against relying on strength alone, urging patience before acting, and looking past the surface explanation of things. A binding pact called Sosmir, blood allegiance, ties individual dragons to deaths stronger than any oath a mortal could swear. Some dragons survived captivity instead of the wild. Numinex was held prisoner for years by a Nordic king named Olaf One-Eye. Durnevir became trapped in a realm called the Soul Cairn for so long that his soul bonded to the place itself, turning him into something between a dragon and an undead thing. Their remains outlasted plenty of them too. Dragon scale and dragonbone armor, a practice the Akaviri brought west, along with everything else they introduced to Tamrielic warfare, stayed in use by the Imperial Legion long after most dragons had died off or gone into hiding, and war horns carved from actual dragon horns, capable of stunning a dragon with sound alone, were manufactured by the Dragon Guard well into the late First Era. The highest-ranking dragon priests from the Merethic era were given magical masks, each one carrying the same name as the priest who wore it, with enchantments strange and powerful enough to outlast the eras entirely. Those masks were buried alongside their owners and stayed that way for thousands of years, until Alduin's return in the Fourth Era woke the undead priests wearing them right back up. That belief turned out to be wrong, though barely. A small number of dragons survived in scattered hiding for centuries, protected in a few cases by deals struck with the Empire itself, and one of them, Paarthurnax, spent that entire stretch in seclusion atop the throat of the world, watched over first by the Greybeards, and later by an unbroken line of emperors who kept the Blades from finishing what they'd started against him. Paarthurnax isn't a simple figure in any of this. His own name translates to something like ambition, overlord, cruelty, and by his own account he committed real atrocities as Alduin's second-in-command long before he ever turned on his brother. He's missing part of one horn for reasons nobody has ever recorded. He blames the Akaviri specifically for finishing off most of what was left of his kind, since it was Tsaishi hunters, generations later, who slaughtered the bulk of his remaining brothers late in the First Era. And even after he helped the mortal defeat Alduin a second time, centuries afterward in the Fourth Era, the Blades still wanted him dead for what he'd done during the original war, leaving his ultimate fate, after everything he'd done for both sides by then, still unresolved. Akatosh's exact role in all of this remains disputed even among Nords themselves, with some treating Alduin as a distinct and lesser figure from Akatosh, and others insisting the two are simply the same god under different names, and neither position ever gets fully settled in the sources. What isn't disputed is the ending. After the war against Alduin came a quieter, deliberate hunting season, aimed at whichever dragons wouldn't bend the knee, and that hunt is the real reason dragons nearly vanished from Tamriel for the better part of 2 eras before a handful of them ever turned up again. Last on this list are the Dwemer, and they get the most room here, because their ending is the one nobody has ever actually explained. Set aside whatever image comes to mind first. Popular children's stories about the Dwemer, the kind collected in books like the Ancient Tales of the Dwemer, paint them as familiar, almost cozy figures, comfortable and human-like. That picture is wrong, and it's worth saying so plainly, because the real Dwemer were something else. The more sober description of them calls the Dwemer fearsome, unfathomable, and even cruel, though also careful, intelligent, and industrious. They were free-thinking. Reclusive clans, organized less like a single nation and more like a scattering of independent city-states, all devoted to science, engineering, and the arcane, and largely uninterested in the gods everyone around them worshipped. Where the Chimer built their whole society around fundamentalist ancestor worship, the Dwemer were openly skeptical of religion, preferring reason and mechanism to faith, and that skepticism shows up everywhere in what they built. Their name itself carries some of that skepticism. Dwemer translates to something like deep elves or deep folk, and some scholars read it just as easily as smart elves, a translation that fits a people who mocked the foolish rituals of Daedra worshippers and preferred, in their own words, gods of reason and logic instead. Whether the Dwemer worshipped anything at all in any ordinary sense is genuinely unclear. What is clear is that they scorned faith the same way they scorned imprecision, and that same attitude carried into how they raised their own children, who are said to have been read unusual bedtime rhymes, built more around puzzles than comfort. Despite centuries of legend calling them tiny, the physical evidence from their ruins tells a different story. Their armor is sized for an ordinary human or elf, and the whole idea of the Dwemer as small people seems to come from an old fable that giants gave them the nickname dwarf out of affection, not because they were actually little. There's a second, stranger explanation for that nickname that has nothing to do with giants at all. Some sources trace the Dwemer skill at bending natural law back to the Elnofe, the same beings whose disappearance turned them into physical law itself. According to that theory, the Elnofe took on students before they vanished from the world, passing pieces of their knowledge along to a few of the races coming up behind them. And the Dwemer were one of those student races, learning how to defy decay and cross between realms just by watching their teachers work. Under that reading, the word dwarves was a title given to them by their own instructors, calling them the small, brilliant students of something much larger than themselves. Nobody can confirm this any more than they can confirm the giant story, but it fits a pattern already seen elsewhere on this list, where the ancestors of the Bosmer are said to have learned how to defy the same laws by watching Y'ffre in the same way. The Dwemer settled Morrowind before recorded history really gets going, founding a territory called Dwemereth along its coasts, and by the late Middle Merethic era, they'd come into serious conflict with the newly arrived Khymer over land, resources, and religion. Historians tend to blame the Khymer for provoking most of that conflict, and the Dwemer usually came out on the losing end of it despite their skill with magic, simply because the Khymer were a small population up against a technological advantage the Dwemer had already built. That changed when the Nords invaded and conquered mainland Morrowind under High King Vrage, giving both races a common enemy. Khymer leader Nerevar and Dwemer king Dumak Dwarfking forged a real friendship out of that shared fight, drove the Nords out by the year 416 of the First Era, and built an alliance, the First Council, that gave both races nearly 3 centuries of real peace and prosperity together. That friendship showed up in small, ordinary ways too, not just treaties. Dumak is said to have given a pair of enchanted swords, Hope's Fire and True Flame, as wedding gifts to Nerevar and his wife Almalexia, and he handed a whole wing of a Dwemer facility called Kemelze over to Nerevar's counselor Sothasil, who used the space to start the earliest work on what would eventually become his Clockwork City. Dumak and Nerevar even traveled together to the coronation of an emperor named Gorius in the year 461, representing their joint kingdom as equals in a hall full of people who still hated elves on principle. None of that friendship survived what came later, and none of it kept Dumak's name from turning into an insult afterward. Centuries on, Dunmer still swear Dumak take it the way other people might invoke a curse, and a few Bosmer picked up the same phrase secondhand, which means the clearest linguistic trace the last Dwemer king left behind isn't a monument or a book, it's a curse word. Not every Dwemer clan agreed with that alliance. Around the year 420 of the First Era, Clan Rorken rejected the deal with the Khymer entirely and chose to leave rather than live under it. According to the story, their chieftain threw the clan's mighty hammer, Volendrung, as far as it would go and led his people out across Tamriel to wherever it landed. It came down in what's now Hammerfell, and the Rorken named their new territory Volenfell after the hammer itself, in a name that survives, worn down slightly, as Hammerfell to this day. Another clan, Kragen, later followed the same westward instinct and pushed into Skyrim instead, founding Arkhntams as the first Dwemer city-state there, and other clans followed them west until a loose alliance of 4 Skyrim city-states had formed, one strong enough that it was considered unbeatable. That name, Völunnfell, is one of the very few pieces of spoken Dwemerys anyone can still translate with any confidence. Almost nothing else of the language survives in a form modern scholars trust, and most translation attempts have to lean on Aldmeris for comparison, since a handful of later Dwemer records, written after Resdayn was founded, used Aldmeri script instead of their own. Even in Aldmeris, plenty of specific Dwemery words stay stubbornly uncertain, and the written glyphs themselves don't even match from one Dwemer region to the next. The glyphs carved into ruins on the island of Stros M'Kai look noticeably different from the ones found across Morrowind and Cyrodiil, which suggests the different clans either wrote their own language differently or simply changed it over time. Völunnfell itself breaks down into 2 working fragments, Volun, meaning hammer, and Fell, meaning city, so the name is nothing more mysterious than City of the Hammer, named for the exact weapon Clan Rorken's chieftain threw across Tamriel to begin with. Clan Rorken's exile in Hammerfell didn't stay peaceful for long either. At some later point, an entirely new breed of goblin, taller and far less cowardly than the goblins anyone else in Tamriel knew, poured into the province through a tier in space and time that came to be called the Goblin Gate. They arrived already organized into a huge fighting force, worshipping a god of their own named Maluk, and they tore through Rorken territory, burning towns and driving the Dwemer of Hammerfell out on an exodus to parts unknown. In a detail nobody has ever fully explained, Volendrung, the same hammer their chieftain once threw to found the whole territory, eventually came to be associated instead with Malakath, a god the Dwemer of Hammerfell would have counted among their most bitter enemies by the time it happened. That alliance is where things really started to fall apart. Deep in their minds, the Skyrim clans found a rare, glowing blue crystal nobody had ever seen before, called Aetherium, alchemically inert and impossible to work with through any normal process, but clearly full of magical potential. 4 city-states, Arkhantams, Ralbetar, Betarzel, and Mazulft, formed a formal alliance specifically to extract, study, and process it, and together they built something called the Aetherium Forge to turn the crystal into working artifacts. The forge worked. The artifacts it produced were powerful enough to be worth fighting over, and that's exactly what happened. The alliance between the 4 clans shattered almost the moment those artifacts existed, and the city-states went to war with each other and their rivals over control of the forge. Decades of that infighting left every one of them badly weakened, weak enough that High King Geller of Skyrim, watching from the surface, conquered the entire lot of them in only 3 years. A stretch of time the Nords themselves found shocking given how long those same cities had resisted every earlier attempt. It would take the Dwemer a full century to win those cities back. Before any of the fighting started, the same 4 city-states had gone looking even deeper into their minds and found something they called the Dark Heart, a second mysterious power source they built entire apparatuses just to study and control. They founded a shared research settlement, the Library of Arctzant, specifically so the 4 clans could pool what they were learning, and used the Dark Heart's own energy, along with kinetic and tonal forces, to power an orrery built to chart the void itself. None of that cooperation survived the war that followed. Once the alliance shattered over the Aetherium Forge, the Library of Arctzend was abandoned along with everything else, and whatever else the Dwemer had learned about the Dark Heart went back underground with them for good. Centuries later, in the Second Era, Reach folk fighting off an invading force called the Grey Host rediscovered the abandoned library and pulled Aetherium-filled gems out of the Guardian constructs still standing watch there, hoping to use their enchantments as a weapon against an enemy the Dwemer themselves had never lived to see. Even setting the Aetherium Forge aside, Dwemer technology went further than almost anything else built on Nirn. Most of their old settlements are still guarded by animated constructs called animunculi, commonly known as centurions or spheres. Mechanical guardians that stay linked somehow to the ruin they were built in and lose power completely if anyone tries to move them elsewhere. Dwemer headgear called miters gave whole populations something close to telepathy, an ability called the calling, letting clans communicate across huge distances, with the master miter acting as a kind of central relay for the whole network. Their cities were dug down to a depth they called a geocline before any real building started, built from precise, angled stonework instead of arches or curves, and threaded with pipes and boilers that in some ruins are still faintly running today, centuries after anyone was left to maintain them. They studied the sky just as carefully as they studied everything underground, and their star charts survive in enough ruins to piece together part of what's now called the Dwarven Pantheon, their own private set of names for constellations every other culture in Tamriel already called something else. What everyone else knew as the apprentice, the Dwemer called the automaton. The Atronach became the war machine, the mage became the mechanist, and the ritual became the laboratory. Even that much agreement didn't hold across every Dwemer city. The star charts found at Bamzamshent and the ones found at Bzark don't fully match each other, with the Betsark charts leaving the laboratory out of the pattern entirely and drawing the serpent differently than Bamzamshent did. No surviving record explains why two groups of the same people studying the same night sky would end up disagreeing about it. None of that engineering saved them from being remembered, at least among the Redguards of Hammerfell, as something closer to myth than history. The Redguards never lived alongside the Dwemer directly, and yet they still swear oaths by dwarf kings and by the Great Hammer, and Redguard legend describes the Dwemer as a people capable of bending the laws of nature to their will. Even now, initiates of a Redguard knightly order called the Order of the Scarab have to travel to old Dwemer ruins and get abandoned mechanical constructs working again before they're allowed to join. A civilization that vanished this completely still gets treated, generations later, as something worth proving yourself against. Long after the Dwemer were gone, Ethereum kept causing trouble for whoever went looking for it. A Nord adventurer named Katria spent years trying to prove the old Ethereum forge had actually existed, only to die exploring the ruins of Arkanthams, and it took her own restless spirit, centuries later, guiding a different adventurer to finally recover the scattered pieces of the Ethereum crest and put the whole story to rest. Katria never even got credit for her own research while she was alive. Her apprentice, a Dunmer named Taran Dreth, took her findings and published them under his own name instead. So, the one Nord, who actually proved the Ethereum Wars really happened, spent her final years chasing a discovery that someone else got to claim. Even a crystal nobody could ever actually put to use kept swallowing lives long after the people who first mined it had disappeared. The Dwemer's old cities kept causing trouble for other races too, well after the Dwemer themselves were gone. Sometime after the Alessian slave rebellion, a handful of elite kingdoms went looking for something called the Wrathstone, believing it would lead them to a weapon strong enough to save them from the rising Alessian Empire. An Aelid army marched on the old Dwemer city of Mzulft in Skyrim, where rumor placed the stone, and laid siege to it, but never managed to break in or find anything worth finding. What the Aelids never learned was that Mzulft only ever held half of the Wrathstone to begin with. The other half sat at a nearby settlement called Kagrenzel, and a Dwemer architect named Muvnak worried the siege meant Kagrenzel's own defenses weren't strong enough anymore, moved that half somewhere safer, and built an entirely new vault just to hold it. That vault eventually got buried under a mountain of ice and lost for good, and by the time later Dwemer at Mzulft tried using one of their own instruments to search for it, no record survives of what, if anything, they actually found. While all of that was happening in Skyrim, the Dwemer in Morrowind were sitting on something much bigger. The story behind it goes back to the very beginning of the world. According to the myth, the gods Ariel and Trinimac killed the god Lorkhan on top of a place called Adamantine Tower, right after the Mundus itself had just been finished. And Trinimac reached into Lorkhan's chest and tore his heart out with something more than hands. The heart didn't die. It laughed at them instead, since by that point it had already become part of the new world, too tied to it to be killed the way a person can be killed. Auriel's answer was to fasten the heart to an arrow and shoot it clean across the world rather than let it keep existing anywhere nearby, and it eventually came down beneath what's now Vardenfell, the impact shaping Red Mountain into the mountain it still is today. Deep beneath that mountain, the Dwemer found the strange, pulsing remains of that same heart, known ever after as the Heart of Lorkhan. According to some accounts, a single drop of the heart's blood fell into a well of captured starlight as it flew overhead, and the elves who found it later cut and polished that hardened drop of blood into the Kim El Adabal, the red gem set at the center of the Amulet of Kings, the same amulet Alessia would use centuries afterward to seal her own covenant with Akatosh. A single dead god's heart, in other words, is tangled up in both the extinction of the Dwemer and the founding stone of the empire that came after them. The Dwemer's chief tonal architect, a figure named Kagrenak, spent years devising a set of tools specifically built to tap the heart's power, a gauntlet called Wraithguard, a hammer called Sunder, and a short blade called Keening. Kagrenak's plan, so far as it can be reconstructed from the surviving accounts, was to use those tools on the heart to build a colossal new god of brass called Numidium, a construct meant to raise the Dwemer to a level beyond ordinary mortality, possibly making the entire race immortal in the process. Not every Dwemer agreed this was worth the risk. Some of Kagrenak's own colleagues warned that tampering with a dead god's heart carried consequences nobody could predict, while Kagrenak and his allies pushed ahead regardless. Kagrenak himself carried more titles than just Chief Tonal Architect. He was called High Priest, Magecrafter, and High Engineer at different points, and in the little understood religious life the Dwemer did have, he functioned as something close to a religious leader in his own right. His teachings were studied at a Dwemer settlement called Keraka, said to house the most learned people in the world, where understanding the self and its relationship to the heart was treated as the most valuable pursuit there was. He didn't work alone. Underlings like Dark Mezalf and Ptwant Mzanch, the author of a text called The Egg of Time that argued Kagrenak's plan carried less risk than his critics claimed, helped design some of the era's other famous creations, including Moon and Star, a ring enchanted specifically so that only Nerevar could ever wear it. Kagrenak kept his own working library at a settlement called Turei Nulal, and whatever he understood by the end, he doesn't seem to have left behind clear notes explaining it. A Cyrodiilic historian named Borgusilus Malier put together his own theory about the ending centuries later, dating the whole event to the year 668 of the First Era. In Malier's account, Kagrenak used the calling itself, that same long-distance mental link the Miters gave every Dwemer to gather his entire people at once, on purpose, and not by accident, for what Malier called a great, sublime journey. Nothing about that theory can be confirmed any more than the others can, but it's one of the few that treats the disappearance as something the Dwemer chose, rather than something that simply happened to them. When the Chimer found out what Kagrenak was building, they considered it an act of blasphemy, and depending on which account gets followed, that discovery either triggered the War of the First Council outright, or simply gave an existing conflict its final, decisive shape. The war built to a single climactic clash at Red Mountain, and in the middle of that battle, at the exact moment Kagrenak is believed to have finally turned his tools on the heart, every Dwemer across all of Tamriel disappeared, not just the ones fighting at Red Mountain, every single one of them, everywhere, all at once. Dumak's own role in how the war actually started depends entirely on which account gets followed, and the differences aren't small. One version, the one most commonly repeated, has Dumak completely unaware of Kagranak's project, meaning his claim of innocence to Nerevar was the truth, right up until Nerevar's anger at feeling lied to drag both races into war anyway. A very different Nordic tradition instead claims Dumak and Nerevar stayed loyal to each other the whole time, and that the war was actually pushed by other parties within their own ranks, with the Nords getting pulled in on a false promise about recovering their own dead god Shor's heart. A third tradition, followed by some of the more secular great houses, describes outright religious hatred between the Dwemer and the Orthodox Khmer houses as the real cause, with no misunderstanding involved at all. Even how Dumak died changes from one telling to the next: killed by Nerevar in personal combat, killed by his own ally Dagoth Ur, or simply lost somewhere in the fog of the battle, depending on whose account gets trusted. What every version agrees on is simpler than all of that. After the battle, Dumak and every other Dwemer in the world were gone. Nobody has ever confirmed what actually happened next, and the honest state of the record is that several competing theories exist side by side, with no way to pick a winner among them. One version says Kagranak's use of his tools simply misfired, wiping out his entire race as an unintended side effect of trying to make them gods. Another says the attempt actually worked, in a sense, granting the Dwemer a kind of existence beyond the world rather than destroying them outright, which would make their disappearance closer to an ascension than a death. A different tradition, followed by some Ashlanders, credits Nerevar himself, with help from the Daedric prince Azura, with deliberately erasing the Dwemer as an act of war. Other Ashlander accounts push back on that and say the Dwemer destroyed themselves, with no outside hand involved at all. Vivek's own sermons give yet another version, claiming Kagranak actually got Numidium working and unleashed it against the Khmer armies before the combined power of the tribunal managed to stop it, and that the fighting itself is what created the Inner Sea. When later explorers rediscovered untouched Dwemer ruins at Bums Amshant, they found piles of ash sitting on chairs, in beds, and next to weapons and armor, exactly where Dwemer bodies should have been, which at least supports the idea that whatever happened to them, it happened suddenly and to their physical bodies directly, and not to a population that simply walked off somewhere. None of these theories can be confirmed, and none of them should get presented as if it were the settled answer, because the sources genuinely disagree with each other on this point more than almost anywhere else in Tamrielic history. What can be said is that the disappearance and Kagranak's attempt to switch on a new god both happened at essentially the same moment, and most of the available evidence points toward those two facts being connected rather than coincidental. Numidium itself has a long history after that moment, being rebuilt, reactivated, and destroyed more than once by later rulers who found pieces of it, but that's a large story of its own and doesn't belong here in detail. What matters for the Dwemer is simply this: Kagranak built it to be a new god, powered by a dead god's heart, and his own people vanished before he ever got the chance to see whether it had worked. That leaves one Dwemer left in the entire world. His name is Yagrum Bagern, and at the time his people disappeared, he happened to be somewhere else entirely, in an undescribed place the sources only call the Outer Realm. When he made his way back to Tamriel, he found his entire race simply gone, and he has spent the centuries since looking for them, without success. In his prime, before any of this happened, Yagrum Bagern was considered a wise scholar and worked as a master crafter directly under Kagranak himself, though he wasn't involved in the Numidium project and has always refused to explain what he understands of Kagranak's theories, believing they should die with him rather than ever be used again. At the request of Divide Fear, he spent centuries compiling his own notes into a catalog of legendary Tamrielic artifacts, a book that went through a few different titles before settling on Tamrielic lore, and copies of it spread across Tamriel long before most readers had any idea its author was the very last member of an entire vanished race. Somewhere along the way, he contracted Corprus, the same incurable magical disease that turns its victims into slowly mutating monsters over time, and it left him bloated, deformed, and for a while, insane. He was taken in by Divaith Fear, a Dunmer sorcerer who has been alive for around 4,000 years, ever since he was born a Chimer himself, before the curse ever touched his people. Fear was once close friends with Sotasil, and dabbled in necromancy in his youth before turning to safer branches of magic, though safer is a relative word for a man who has kidnapped rivals, kept slaves, and is even suspected of arranging the disappearance of 2 of his own academic colleagues. He has spent a long stretch of his long life studying Corprus in the hope of curing it, and keeps his patients in a set of caverns beneath his tower of Telfir called the Corprusarium, guarded by a former slave of his named Vista Kai. Vista Kai was an Argonian Fear eventually freed, who chose to stay on afterward anyway, taught himself how to fight, and earned enough trust over the years to help train Fear's own 4 daughters, Alphe, Beite, Delte, and Upse, identical clones of the sorcerer himself who share his tower with him to this day. One of those daughters, Upse Fear, can calm the Corprus-twisted monsters roaming the outer caverns just by playing an old goreskin drum for them, which is about as close as anyone alive has come to soothing a disease nobody has ever actually cured. Visitors are allowed to walk through the Corprusarium freely, on one condition: nobody is permitted to harm the diseased kept there, no matter how monstrous the disease has made them look. Yagrum Bagarn has lived in those caverns for a very long time now, his memory slowly and only partially returning over the years, still showing the physical signs of the disease that Fear has never managed to cure. The last living member of the most advanced civilization this entire list has covered spends his days in a cave under someone else's house, sick with a disease nobody can fix, still trying to remember exactly what his own people were like before they disappeared. That's the actual ending of the Dwemer story, and it's a strange kind of ending for a people who once built flying machines, thinking mechanical soldiers, and lighting systems that still work centuries later without any maintenance at all. They didn't fade away like the Lilmothit. They didn't get killed in a war like the Kothringi or the Nedes. They didn't transform into something new like the Snow Elves or the Chimer. They just stopped being there, everywhere, all at the same instant, in the middle of trying to become gods, and nobody who was there to see it survived to explain what actually happened. Of everyone on this entire list, the Dwemer are the only ones who really vanished. Line all 14 up again, and the pattern from the start holds up. The Kothringi, the Nedes, and whatever the original men of Akavir actually were, got killed, by disease, by invasion, or by something the sources themselves can't agree on. The Lilmothit and the Orma just faded away, with no war and no plague anyone can point to, leaving behind a children's toy and a skull nailed to a door. The Snow Elves, the Chimer, the Aldmer, and the Elnofey all transformed into the Falmer, into the Dunmer, into every elf alive today, and into the laws of nature itself, and every one of them is still here in some form, just wearing a different name. The Aelids might belong in that same group too, hiding instead of gone. Nobody has ever managed to prove it either way. The left-handed elves and the drow sit somewhere in between, driven into the sea or reduced from god kings to hunted beast folk, their old selves possibly still out there under new names nobody has confirmed. Dragons went from ruling the world to nearly vanishing to turning up again centuries later, never quite fitting neatly into any one box. Only one people on this entire list actually vanished, all at once, with nothing left behind but ashes on chairs and one sick, forgetful survivor living in someone else's basement. That's the Dwemer, and they're the only ones who really earned the word extinct without any asterisk attached to it. Everyone else is still here, in one form or another, The word extinct was hiding that the whole time.